Welcome to the Wingwag. I'm your host, Jack O'Lynn. I'm an instrument-rated pilot and the owner of an aviation company and flight school here in Central Florida.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not guaranteed to be accurate or complete. While we research each topic, we are humans and occasionally make mistakes. For the most up-to-date information on regulations, check out the official Federal Aviation Regulations, also known as the FARs, or consult an aviation attorney. Lastly, the opinions expressed on this podcast are the guest's opinions and are not necessarily the opinions of the host or podcast. Have you ever wondered how they transported the space shuttle? The space shuttle did not always land where it was launched from. And critically, the space shuttle could not fly under its own power. It was simply a glider on re-entry. So whenever it landed in another location, such as Edwards Air Force Base, and it needed to make it back to the launch site at Kennedy Space Center, it would hop onto a modified 747 and take one of the world's most expensive piggyback rides. Welcome to this week's episode of The Wingwag. For those of you who are watching the videos, you may have noticed that I'm always accompanied in the studio by this Lego Concorde. This was actually a gift from my wife to me 2 years ago on my birthday. And for my birthday this year, which was last week, she got me another Lego set. The Shuttle Carrier Aircraft. So this year I actually got two airplanes. Well, an airplane and a glider, we'll say. And I know it's not built. It would have been a lot cooler if I had built it, but I didn't have time to build it before this episode. But I thought it would be a good chance to talk about the Shuttle Carrier Aircraft, because I have seen pictures of it, but I knew very little about it until now, and it's really interesting. So one thing I want to note, I grew up here in Florida, and I've seen many shuttle launches, and I remember it being like a big part of my childhood, going out on the driveway and watching the shuttle take off and the shuttle come back. But there are many aspects of the shuttle program that I never knew about, the shuttle carrier being one of them. And another, I didn't realize that the word space shuttle refers to the whole assembly of the orbiter, the fuel tanks, and the external rockets. I just call the airplane part the space shuttle, but really that's the Space Shuttle Orbiter. But in this video, definitely I'm going to use those terms interchangeably, whether I want to or not, just out of habit. So when NASA first decided to do the shuttle program, when they were first developing the program, they knew that they would have to transport the shuttles somehow, right? Like I said, they occasionally land where they don't take off from. And you could just say, okay, just make it land wherever it launches from. Have it always land at Kennedy Space Center. But the weather in one location is not always guaranteed, so they had backup locations around the world. In particular, Edwards Air Force Base was the secondary landing location, as well as I think there was one landing at a White Sands Space Harbor in New Mexico. And there was a variety of other landing locations selected around the world, but those three were the only ones that were ever used. The Edwards Air Force Base, White Sands, and the Kennedy Space Center landing facility. So NASA knew that they would have to transport the shuttle somehow, and it wasn't feasible to have the shuttle take off again. It's too heavy, too not aerodynamic, doesn't carry enough fuel. So it really only glides when it's not in its rocket formation. It's very large. It's very large and very heavy. You could transport it by ship, but there's no water routes that go to Edwards Air Force Base in the middle of the desert. And so the natural choice was to fly it out, like put it on the back of a bigger airplane and fly it out to wherever it wanted to go. And NASA first thought about using the C-5, the military cargo plane, because it's gigantic and has a very large lifting capacity. But there was some debate between the Air Force and NASA over who would actually own the aircraft versus operate it. And NASA wanted to outright own the aircraft, so they ended up going with the 747, which also has great carrying capacity and could carry the shuttle. The orbiter, sorry. So NASA purchased their first 747, which was November 905, November Alpha, from American Airlines in 1974 for the testing phase of the shuttle program. And then later on in the program in 1988, they purchased a second aircraft carrier, Shuttle Carrier Aircraft, November 911 November Alpha from Japan Airlines. Like I was saying, the 747 has a really great carrying capacity, but even then it was not made, obviously, to carry the shuttle orbiter on its back. So significant modifications had to be made before it was ready to enter into service with the shuttle program. So the first thing they did, the most obvious thing they did, was install a mounting system on the top of the 747. You can see what that looks like in Lego form right here. So we have a single mount up near the front and then two near the back. And what's kind of funny, I saw this on Wikipedia, there's a picture. The NASA engineers had written little jokes on the mounting points. Like one of them said, attach orbiter here, note black side down, right? So you don't accidentally install the shuttle upside down. So back to modifications. To support the weight on this mounting system, they had to reinforce the fuselage. They also had to install extra vertical stabilizers on the end of the horizontal stabilizer. I'll show you again in the picture. Right here, we can see these extra vertical stabilizers that are not present on a standard 747. So they did that for extra stability. If I'm guessing it's because the orbiter, when it's mounted onto the airplane, is blocking the airflow over the standard vertical stabilizer. So they put two ones on the side for extra stability. They also upgraded the avionics, the engines. They stripped out all the seats except for the first class section in case they ever had NASA passengers. They also had to install a ballast system because the center of gravity was so wildly different between when the orbiter was on the aircraft and when it wasn't, that they had to set up a ballast system that would move weights around depending on if the orbiter was attached or not, to keep flight stable. As you can imagine, flying with something so large and heavy on the top of the 747 greatly reduced its performance. I have some stats. I'm going to read them here because I don't want to say them wrong. So the max cruise speed of a standard 747 is Mach 0.92, whereas it was decreased to Mach 0.6 for the Shuttle Carrier Aircraft, about 250 knots. The range was decreased from about 6,500 nautical miles to just 1,100 nautical miles, and the service ceiling was lowered from 45,000 feet to 15,000 feet. All of that with the orbiter, of course. Without the orbiter, it probably performed similar to a 747. Since the carrier aircraft that actually comes with the set is 905, I think I'm going to focus on that one for the rest of the episode. So just like the other carrier, 905 primarily was used to ferry shuttle orbiters between landing sites and launch sites. It also did a couple of other jobs. It would ferry the orbiter from the factory where it was made to the launch site or back to the factory for maintenance. When an aircraft or when a shuttle was on tour or being sent to a museum, it would ride on the back of the carrier aircraft. It would ride on the back of 905. 905 also played a critical role in the development of the shuttle program. So between the shuttle program being announced in the actual first shuttle launch, they did significant testing of, I'm sure, all of the systems and all of the things that could possibly go wrong. But in particular, the one that's relevant to this situation is they tested the aerodynamics of the orbiter. They wanted to see, was it really feasible to glide down from space and land like an airplane? And so what they did a series of 16 tests called the approach and landing tests that were with 905 and the test shuttle Enterprise. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the approach and landing tests in just one second. But first, I just want to mention what the ultimate fate of 905 was after the shuttle program ended. So in 2011, when the shuttle program ended, 905 was retired along with 911, and 905 went to Space Center Houston and is on display with the Space Shuttle mock-up Independence on its back. And a fun fact, I've actually seen Space Shuttle Independence. It used to be at Kennedy Space Center as a display that you could like walk through. But when Kennedy Space Center got its current shuttle, which I believe is Atlantis, Independence was sent to Houston, part of the 905 display. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the approach and landing tests. So this was a series of tests that took place out of Edwards Air Force Base in 1977. And there were, like I said, there were 16 different tests. The first 3 of them were taxi tests. They would simply mount the shuttle to the carrier aircraft and taxi around the Air Force Base just to make sure that the 747 could handle normally with the load on the back. The next phase was called the captive phase. The captive phase consisted of a series of 8 flights with the orbiter mounted to the back of the aircraft. And for those flights, they were called captive because the orbiter stayed mounted to the aircraft for the entirety of the flight and the aircraft landed with the shuttle still attached. So that was to test the aerodynamics of the carrier and orbiter system together to make sure that the 747 could handle in the air, could take off and land without problems, could do maneuvers. So in this phase, 5 flights were called inactive captive flights. For these flights, the systems of the shuttle were powered down and there was no crew on board. But the next 3 were the active captive flights, in which there was a crew on board and some of the shuttle systems were turned on to simulate what it would be like in a free fly situation, which we'll get to in a second. So the final phase of the approach and landing tests was the free fly phase. The free fly phase consisted of 5 flights in which the carrier aircraft would take off with the shuttle, and at a certain altitude, it would release the shuttle, and the shuttle would be on its own to glide back down to Earth and land. And this was to test the aerodynamics of the shuttle itself without the 747, and to make sure that the pilots could land it effectively. Something interesting about this. While I was reading about this, I was wondering what was the actual mechanism to detach the shuttle from the 747, and they talked about this a little bit. During the free fly flights, they would purposely mount the shuttle with a higher angle of attack. They would raise the mount on the nose a little bit higher to give it a higher angle of attack compared to the 747. When they got to altitude and were ready to release the shuttle, the 747 would go full power and would begin a dive. But since the shuttle's at a higher angle of attack, the shuttle would start generating a lot more lift. And they were saying that for a moment, the shuttle was completely supporting the weight of the 747. And once that was happening, they would ignite some explosive charges on the mounting system, like forcing them apart. And then that would create a lot of separation. So there was less danger of the 2 aircrafts colliding right after separation. And then, they would perform maneuvers to get away from each other, and the shuttle would glide down. One thing I thought was very interesting when I was reading about the approach and landing tests was just how fast they went from being just a crewed shuttle mounted to the aircraft testing the systems to doing like the free flights and then the shuttle launches. Like, I'm sure they had some sort of space shuttle flight simulator to practice on, but just seeing that they did 3 flights with crew mounted to the aircraft, and then after that they just did 5 free flights. That's it. And then they landed the shuttle for real on a real launch. Yeah, that just seems wild to me, especially because the shuttle they were using for the free flight tests, Enterprise, was a test shuttle, and it did end up being different from the actual shuttles used in launches. It had different weighting. It was a lot lighter because they didn't have real engines. And so pilots that had flown both said that it definitely handled differently. Like, they were similar enough that obviously didn't cause any issues. But yeah, that just kind of blows my mind. But it worked out for the most part. At least the landing aspect of the shuttle worked out. Now let's spend a little bit of time talking about the shuttle Enterprise, the Shuttle Orbiter Enterprise, which is the shuttle in the Lego set. The official name of the Shuttle Enterprise is OV-101, which stands for Orbital Vehicle. I believe, 101. And it was the first orbiter made in 1976. And it was actually originally called the Constitution, and it was going to be released on Constitution Day, 1976. Oh yeah, that would have been the bicentennial. But they changed the name to the Enterprise after many Star Trek fans wrote in to the president requesting that they call it the Enterprise. And so there's this picture online of them cast of Star Trek in front of the Enterprise taking a picture, which is kind of cool. But yeah, I also do like the name Constitution. That would have been cool too. Like I mentioned earlier, Enterprise is a test shuttle. So it never went to space. It was only used in testing. It did not have real engines. It did not have any heat shielding. And it didn't have some of the internal systems like radar, for example. When they first built Enterprise, they had planned to refit it with all of the systems that the normal orbiters had after the testing phase was done so that it could join the fleet and do normal space launches like the others. But they, at some point along the line, they changed the design of the shuttle a little bit, and they found that it would be cheaper to just build the new shuttles with maybe spare parts or build them outright than to try to convert the Enterprise. And there were more talks of converting the Enterprise after the Challenger disaster, but they never came into fruition. Since Enterprise was never refit for an actual launch, unfortunately, its career was kind of done after the approach and landing tests. It was involved in a little bit more testing after that, like it was involved in something called fit checks, where they would test like different launch facilities by putting a mock-up rocket on it with Enterprise. It was involved a little bit in the investigation after the Columbia disaster, but primarily it's been a museum piece or like a touring piece since then. Enterprise spent a good amount of 1984 in New Orleans for the 1984 Louisiana World Exposition. And then from 1985 until 2003, it was in the Smithsonian's hangar at Washington Dulles International Airport. And then when the Udvar-Hazy National Air and Space Museum, also at Dulles, was constructed, the shuttle Enterprise went and lived there until 2012, I believe. So it was at Udvar-Hazy from 2003 to 2012. And so, side note real quick, I have been to Udvar-Hazy, and it is one of the most amazing aerospace museums I've ever seen. I definitely recommend going. So Enterprise is no longer there, and so when I was there, I didn't see it. Now they have another shuttle, Discovery. And seeing a shuttle in person is crazy. Like how big it is, how like foreign it looks compared to other aircraft. So I definitely recommend going there. But anyways, so like I said, Discovery is now at Udvar-Hazy. So there was a trade-off of shuttles in 2012 where Discovery came in and Enterprise went out. And there's this really cool picture of the two shuttles on the runways at Washington Dulles International Airport, like nose to nose. And seeing the difference in the two is crazy because so Enterprise never went to space. It was only involved in testing. So it was like perfectly white and clean and looked good. Whereas Discovery was like kind of gray and scuffed up and looked like it had been through hell, realistically, which it kind of had. Like re-entry is super, super hot. And it was just a really cool picture. And so yeah, after that, 905 picked up Enterprise, flew it to New York City to stay at the Intrepid Museum, which is really cool. I didn't know about this museum. It's on the deck of an aircraft carrier off one of the piers of Manhattan, and it has like lots of different aircraft on the different decks of the aircraft carrier, and there's also a Concorde on the dock next to it. But they have the shuttle there on the deck. And I'm kind of mad because I was in New York City like a year and a half ago and I had no idea about this museum. I definitely would have gone to see it if I had known. But that just gives me a reason to go back to New York, I guess. So to end this episode, let's go back to the Lego set. When I first saw that it included the Shuttle Enterprise, I was a little surprised and maybe slightly disappointed. Like, why did they put the test shuttle in here, not one of the real ones, not one of the good ones, right? But after doing a little bit more research, I think it makes a lot of sense to have 905, the carrier, combined with Enterprise, the orbiter, because they had a lot of history together with they were both the first of the fleet. 905 was the first shuttle carrier aircraft, and Enterprise was the first orbiter. They went through the approach and landing tests together and kind of paved the way for the success of the shuttle missions. So there's another fun fact about 905 that I didn't mention earlier. So I said that NASA purchased 905 from American Airlines, and they actually left the American Airlines livery, like the paint job, basically. They left it on there until 1998. So after reading about the approach and landing test, I assumed, oh, this set is like depicting a scene from one of these tests. But if we look, it has the NASA livery, the NASA paint job, not the American Airlines one, which was like red, white, and blue, not just blue. So this scene must be after 1998, and so the only thing I can think of, I couldn't find like a full record of every single flight, but the only thing I can think of is that this set is portraying the final flight of the Enterprise on 905 from Dulles to JFK to go to the Intrepid Museum, and that's kind of cool. So yeah, I think this is a good place to land the orbiter.
Thank you for listening to The Wing Wag. If you liked this episode, please consider subscribing. And if you're out flying today, make sure to give somebody a wing wag.